The first thing I noticed wasn't the missing trees. It wasn't the scar carved into the hillside. It wasn't even the fresh gravel road cutting across my property like someone had drawn a line through a family photo. The first thing I noticed was the feeling. That strange feeling you get when something is wrong before your brain has figured out exactly what it is. I hadn't been home in 14 months. 14 months overseas, 14 months living out of military housing, 14 months counting down days on a calendar while thinking about a piece of land tucked away in the hills outside a little town called Ashford Ridge, Kentucky. That land meant something to me, not because it was worth a fortune. Honestly, it wasn't. If you drove past it, you probably wouldn't even slow down. A few wooded acres, a steep hillside, a rough gravel driveway, the kind of place most people would overlook. But after years of deployments, temporary addresses, and never really knowing where I'd end up next, that land felt permanent. It felt like mine. I bought it in 2021. The plan was simple. No giant mansion, no luxury retreat, just a small cabin eventually. A place where I could sit on a porch and hear wind instead of traffic. A place where nobody expected anything from me. The property had one challenge, though. A steep slope running along the western boundary. Most people saw a problem. I saw a project. I spent 2 years working on drainage plans, consulting engineers, saving money for retaining walls, figuring out how to stabilize everything correctly. Slowly, patiently, the way most worthwhile things get built. Then there was my neighbor. His name was Dennis Calloway. Dennis was one of those guys every rural community seems to have. Early 50s, always wearing work boots, always talking about projects, always carrying himself like he owned more authority than he actually did. To be fair, when I first met him, I didn't dislike him. He seemed friendly enough. We'd wave, talk about weather, complain about rising fuel prices, normal neighbor stuff. But over time I noticed something. Dennis didn't really ask questions. He made observations, and those observations usually sounded suspiciously close to instructions. I'd clear some of those trees. I'd move that fence line. I'd grade that hill. Everything had a better way according to Dennis. Usually his way. The biggest issue in his life seemed to be his driveway. Now I know that sounds ridiculous, but trust me, this driveway mattered. His garage sat at an awkward angle, and every time he tried backing his fishing boat into storage, it turned into a 15-minute production. I'd watched it happen dozens of times. Back up, pull forward, turn, stop, gow, scratch his head, start over. One afternoon before I deployed, I was checking fence markers when Dennis wandered over carrying a coffee mug. He stood there looking at my hillside, not looking at me, looking at the hill. "You ever think about cutting into that slope?" he asked. I shrugged. Eventually, he nodded slowly. "Might make the whole area more useful." "Maybe," I said. "Got plans already. Just taking my time." He smiled, but it wasn't really a smile. It was the look somebody gets when they're imagining something. Calculating. Measuring possibilities. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Looking back now, I should have. A few weeks later, my deployment orders came through. The last evening before leaving, I walked the property. I always did that before heading out. Checked gates. Verified boundary markers. Took photographs. Lots of photographs. Every angle. Every corner. Call it military habit. Call it paranoia. Either way, I documented everything. I remember standing near the hillside as the sun dropped behind the trees, thinking about future retaining walls, thinking about the cabin, thinking about all the work still ahead. Then I locked the gate, got in my truck, and left. 14 months later, I came back. The road into Ashford Ridge looked exactly the same. Same curves, same trees, same old gas station near the county line. For a few minutes, it felt like no time had passed at all. Then I turned on my road, and everything changed. At first, I couldn't identify what was wrong. Something about the tree line felt different. Incomplete, like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. I slowed down, leaning forward over the steering wheel, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then my stomach dropped, because a section of the hillside was gone. Not damaged, not weathered, gone. A massive section had been carved straight out of the slope. And even from the road, I could tell this wasn't some natural event. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't a storm. This was machinery. This was intentional. I pulled into my driveway and got out before the engine fully stopped running. The closer I walked, the worse it got. And by the time I reached the edge of the cut, I realized I wasn't looking at damage. I was looking at a construction project, one that somebody had built on my property while I was gone. And deep down, before I saw a single tire track, before I measured anything, before I reviewed a single photograph, I already knew exactly who had done it. I stood there for a long minute without saying a word. The cut stretched across the hillside like an open wound, maybe 40 feet wide, deep enough to expose layers of soil that had taken decades to settle naturally. And running right through the center of it was a compacted gravel lane, not a rough trail, not some temporary path, a finished access road, the kind somebody spends real money building. I walked slowly along the edge. The gravel was packed tight. The drainage ditches had been shaped. Even the grading looked professional. Whoever did this hadn't shown up one afternoon with a shovel. This took equipment, planning, labor, time. Then I saw the tire marks. Heavy trailer tracks, fresh enough to still be visible. The path curved downhill, crossed the property line, and connected perfectly with Dennis's driveway. His boat trailer couldn't have followed a cleaner route if someone had designed it specifically for him, which apparently someone had. I laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain doesn't know what else to do. I remember saying out loud to nobody, "You got to be kidding me." The strange thing was I wasn't angry. Not yet. People imagine moments like that come with yelling and fists clenched and blood pressure through the roof. But that wasn't what happened. What I felt was colder, much colder, because the second I understood what I was looking at, I understood something else too. This wasn't an accident. Nobody accidentally rents excavators. Nobody accidentally clears trees. Nobody accidentally builds a gravel road across somebody else's property. This had happened because somebody looked at my land, decided it would solve their problem, and convinced themselves they had the right to take it. I went inside the house. The place still smelled closed up from being empty so long. Dust covered parts of the kitchen counter. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Everything felt frozen in time. I sat down at the table and pulled up the photographs I'd taken before deployment. Same hillside, same trees, same natural grade, exactly as I remembered it. Then I looked out the window toward the excavation, and that's when I made my first phone call. My attorney answered on the second ring. His name was Mark Holloway. I'd worked with him once before on a property issue years earlier. Smart guy, calm, the type of attorney who never raised his voice because he never needed to. I explained what I'd found. No exageración, no emotion el speeches. Just facts. Unauthorized excavation, road construction, property damage, no absence, clear evidence. There was a pause. Then he said something that would end up shaping everything that followed. Don't touch a thing, not even the gravel. I asked. No. What about talking to him? Especially don't do that. I leaned back. Why? Because right now he's the guy who dug into your property. The longer you stay quiet, the more opportunities he has to prove it. That answer stuck with me, because he was right. People who think they've gotten away with something tend to keep leaving footprints. Over the next week, we documented everything. Photographs, videos, measurements, drone footage, every inch of the excavation, every tree stump, every section of gravel. Then Mark brought an engineer. His name was Walter Briggs. Late 60s, weathered face, slow walk. The kind of guy who looked like he'd spent 40 years outdoors and preferred it that way. Walter spent nearly 3 hours inspecting the hillside. He dug into exposed soil, checked drainage channels, measured slope angles, took notes constantly. At one point, he stood up and looked directly at me. "You know what the problem is?" he asked. I figured the answer was obvious. The road. He shook his head. "No, the road is the symptom." That got my attention. Walter pointed toward the exposed cut. What they damaged is underneath. Then he started explaining things I hadn't fully appreciated before. The hillside wasn't just dirt. It was part of an entire drainage system. Water had natural routes. Pressure distributed naturally through the slope. Vegetation stabilized everything. By cutting into it, Dennis had interrupted that balance. The gravel made it look finished. But underneath, the structure had been compromised. Heavy rain could eventually create erosion channels. Water concentration could weaken the slope. Sections could shift. Maybe not immediately, maybe years later. But the risk was real, and fixing it wasn't going to be cheap. A week later, his report arrived. I opened the document expecting bad news. What I got was worse. Estimated restoration costs exceeded $36,000 just to return the land to its original condition. Not improve it, not upgrade it, simply restore it. Then came the forestry assessment. 3 mature, white oak trees had been removed during construction. Big trees, healthy trees, the kind that take generations to replace. Their appraised value came back at nearly $9,000. I remember staring at the paperwork spread across my dining room table. Page after page. Numbers, photographs, expert opinions, and something shifted inside me. Until then, this had still felt personal, like a neighbor dispute, a betrayal, an insult, but now it was becoming something else. A financial reality, a legal reality, a problem measured in dollars instead of emotions. And that distinction matters, because emotions can be argued. Numbers usually can't. Then Mark made another call. County Code Enforcement. A few days later, an inspector arrived. His name was Tom Mercer. Tall guy, sunburned neck, clipboard permanently attached to one hand. He walked the site quickly, much faster than Walter had, like someone who already knew what he was looking for. Halfway through the inspection, he stopped, looked at the excavation, looked at the photographs from before deployment, then let out a low whistle. That's bold. I laughed. That's one word for it. Tom shook his head. You'd be surprised how many people think property lines are suggestions. Then he started explaining the regulatory side. The excavation exceeded thresholds requiring permits. Erosion controls should have been filed. Environmental reviews should have been completed. Inspections should have occurred. None of that happened. Not a single permit existed. Not one. The more he talked, the worse Dennis's situation became. Because every missing permit created another violation. And every violation carried penalties. By the time Tom finished his report, the issue had expanded far beyond a private dispute. Now state agencies were involved. Environmental compliance offices were involved. County records were involved. The machine had started moving. And once government paperwork starts rolling downhill, it rarely stops halfway. A formal violation notice was issued less than 2 weeks later. That's when Dennis finally surfaced. Not by walking over, not by apologizing, not by admitting anything. Instead, his attorney contacted mine. Funny how that works. The man who had no problem sending excavators onto my land suddenly didn't want to have a direct conversation. Mark called me afterward. He's nervous. What makes you think that? Because he's asking questions nobody asks unless they're nervous. I smiled. What kind of questions? Questions about settlement. That was the first time I knew, for sure, he understood the danger he was in. But we weren't done yet. Because while Dennis was starting to worry, Mark was just beginning to dig. And what we found next would remove every possible excuse he could have tried to hide behind. What we found next wasn't complicated. Honestly, that's what made it so devastating. People imagine legal cases falling apart because evidence is unclear, witnesses disagree, or timelines get messy. This wasn't one of those cases. This was one of those rare situations where every piece fit together so perfectly it almost felt scripted. Mark started pulling records, equipment rentals, material deliveries, contractor invoices, anything connected to construction activity during the 14 months I had been overseas. And sure enough, the trail appeared almost immediately. The excavator had been rented 7 months into my deployment. 3 consecutive days. The rental agreement carried Dennis's name, his company, his signature. Then came the gravel deliveries. Multiple truckloads, spread across several weeks. And when I saw the delivery paperwork, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. The delivery address wasn't Dennis's property. It was mine, my address, my parcel number, my land. Whoever processed those deliveries had documented the entire trespass for us. The dates matched. The quantities matched. The construction timeline matched. Every excuse disappeared before it could even be spoken. When Mark forwarded the evidence package to Dennis's attorney, the tone changed overnight. The conversations stopped sounding confident. Nobody was talking about misunderstandings anymore. Nobody was discussing boundary confusion. Nobody was pretending there had been a mistake. Now the discussions were about exposure, liability, settlement, damage control. A few days later, I finally saw Dennis. He was standing on his back deck while engineers were reviewing the site again. Arms crossed, watching, silent, the same way he'd watched my property for years. The same way he'd stared at that hillside before I left. For a moment, I considered ignoring him, just walking away. But something told me this was probably the last real opportunity we'd ever have to speak honestly. So I walked toward the property line. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just directly. When I got close enough, I stopped. Dennis looked at me. I looked at him. Then I said the simplest thing possible. You cut 40 feet into my property. For a second, I thought maybe I'd finally hear an apology. Maybe some acknowledgement. Maybe even embarrassment. Instead, he shrugged. Actually shrugged. Then he glanced toward the hillside and said, I cleaned it up. I remember blinking. Not because I didn't hear him. Because I did. Perfectly. I cleaned it up. That was it. That was the entire justification. No permission. No ownership. No responsibility. Just his personal opinion that my land looked better after he changed it. And suddenly everything made sense. Dennis never thought of himself as a thief. He never saw himself as someone taking something that wasn't his. In his mind, he was solving a problem, improving a situation, making a practical decision. The fact that the property belonged to someone else simply wasn't part of the equation. I nodded, took a step backward, then said, We're cleaning it up too. And I walked away. That was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. After that, everything happened on paper. And paper is ruthless. The final calculations came together quickly. Slope restoration, tree replacement value, engineering assessments, legal expenses, environmental penalties, inspection fees, administrative costs. The number kept climbing. 40,000, 50,000, 60,000. When the final estimate landed on my table, total exposure sat just above $64,000. I remember asking Mark, can we go further? He leaned back in his chair. We probably can. And legally, he was right. There were arguments for additional damages. Potential claims involving intentional property destruction. Possibly even criminal investigation, depending on how aggressively authorities wanted to proceed. The option existed. But the more I thought about it, the less interested I became. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need a headline. I didn't need to destroy the man. I wanted my property restored. I wanted accountability. And I wanted the consequences to match the decision. Nothing more. Nothing less. So we made our position clear. Pay everything. Restore everything. Or we keep going. The response came surprisingly fast. Dennis agreed. No dramatic courtroom battle. No television-worthy confrontation. No last-minute tricks. Just signatures. Checks. Compliance. One payment after another. The entire amount. Every dollar. And then came the part one enjoyed most. Not because it punished him. Because it fixed the damage. The restoration crews arrived early on a Monday morning. Dump trucks. Excavators. Surveyors. Engineers. An entire team dedicated to undoing what one man had done. The gravel road disappeared first. Load after load hauled away. Hours of work erased in a single day. I stood outside, holding a cup of coffee, watching it happen. Not smiling, not celebrating, just watching. Because, strangely enough, it felt less like victory and more like closure. The project lasted almost 3 weeks. 18 full days. The slope was rebuilt. Drainage patterns restored. Soil stabilized. Native vegetation replanted. Every stage reviewed by engineers. Every step documented. Done correctly this time. And throughout all 18 days, Dennis watched. Every morning. Every afternoon, every evening, always from the same deck, always with the same crossed arms, never speaking, never approaching, just watching the consequences unfold one truckload at a time. By the end, the hillside looked incredible, honestly better than before, healthy, stable, natural, as if the road had never existed. The engineers signed off. The county closed the file. The environmental concerns were resolved. The case was over. At least for me. A few weeks later, I happened to be outside, working near my driveway when I heard a familiar sound. An engine revving, a trailer backing up. I looked over, and there was Dennis, trying to park his fishing boat, the exact same way he had years earlier. Back up, stop, pull forward, adjust, get out, look around, shake his head, try again. The entire routine. Nothing had changed. I watched for a minute, then went back to what I was doing, because that's the part people always expect me to celebrate. The irony, the karma, the poetic justice. But honestly, what stayed with me wasn't satisfaction. It was the math, the simple reality of it. A man spent over $60,000 trying to avoid a minor inconvenience. And after everything was finished, he ended up exactly where he started. Same driveway, same boat, same problem. The only thing that changed was the cost. We never became neighbors again after that. Not really. We became people who happened to live next to each other. Occasional nods. No conversations. No trust. And maybe that's the real damage in situations like these. Not the money. Not the property. Not even the legal battle. It's what happens when someone decides that your boundaries don't matter. Because once that line gets crossed, things rarely go back to the way they were. And sometimes I still think about that moment. Not the lawsuit. Not the restoration. Not even the settlement. I think about the day Dennis first stood looking at that hillside. The moment he convinced himself nobody would care. The moment he decided being gone meant I wouldn't come back. The moment he believed ownership was optional. That's the decision that changed everything. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have stopped where I did? Would you have accepted the settlement, restored the property, and moved on? Or would you have pushed further and pursued every legal option available, even criminal charges? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who crossed a line they never should have crossed, I'd love to hear that story too. Because sometimes these situations aren't really about land. They're about respect. And once respect disappears, things can get expensive very quickly.